If you follow the news closely, and there's no surprise that today, take a good look at the United States of America. Politically speaking, is standing at the crossroads, and mainly this year it's rather crucial. Just in about 2 months, or even perhaps less than 2 months, this nation is going to elect another brand new president. Certainly, when we talk about this geopolitical change, everyone is very much interested regarding the future for the country, given the fact we're looking at this social political agenda. But meanwhile, if you follow our show closely, not only that we discuss regarding what's happening in the US and also around the world, it is rather imperative we need to look at the history and also some of the historical significant section of the history. In America, for example, how much do we understand regarding this Jewish community, or we call it the Jewish Patriots, that actually made a greater effort to the American Revolution? Of course, we think about those founding fathers, and we believe that some of them, or even most of them, were Christians, or even this evangelical communities. But after reading this book that recently discovered, that's not really the case. I'd really beg the question, what do we know regarding the Jewish Patriots? And why is it critical when we talk about American Revolution or even talk about American transformation? We need to put those people in perspective. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Adam Jortner. Dr. Jortner is the Goodwin-Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion in the Department of History. He specializes in the history of religion in the American Revolution and the early nation, with particularly emphasis on religious liberty, patriotism, and piety. His brand new book, which is called A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. Well, Dr. Jortner, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks, Will. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, Professor, it's such an honor to have you on the show. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, when we talk about American Revolution, we talk about this transformation for the country, I want to dive into the book right away. Now, in the introduction, you wrote, and I quote, "Patriot Jews were early and unstinting in their support for the revolution in synagogues, on the street, and in the army." Professor, let's talk about this a little bit more. Why do you think that when we talk about American Revolution, we talk about all the battles and even the significant figures, too often that we tend to overlook, or we tend to, I guess not intentionally, do not mention the Patriot Jews, which they played a significant part for the American history. What do we understand when we talk about their support for the revolution in the synagogues, on the street, in the army, etc.? Your thoughts?
I think, first of all, I went looking for Jews in the revolution. When I started the project, I was looking for just Jews in the revolution. I didn't know what I would find, and I sort of expected to find one thing, and what I found was something totally different, which is the Jewish community in the revolution is pretty small. There's not a whole lot of Jews. They're basically in 5 cities, but in every city, there is significant support in the Jewish community for the revolution. The Jewish community of America, by and large, backs the revolution. They think this is a good idea. They do not want to be under the crown. They are strong advocates for freedom. They serve in the army. There's a case where a whole bunch of them end up in Philadelphia. They found what is effectively a national synagogue. One of the first national religions in the United States is a synagogue. And then when the war is over, they really help create the religious freedom that we recognize today. In other words, they helped expand that freedom. What I think is important here is that I think there's a tendency to think of the revolution as it's all one type of person, or that everybody back then was just Christian. But that's not the case. There is religious diversity in the Patriot ranks, and the amazing thing was overall, people were very cool with it. George Washington and the American Army, not only do they have Jews serving, they promote Jews to officer status, which was not done in Europe. So in other words, it's not just that Jews are allowed to fight in the army, they're actually allowed to lead in the army. They are being judged on their ability and not on their religious confession and not on their bloodline. And I think that's very significant for the Jewish community, but it is also significant when we talk about where did America come from. We actually have a fairly diverse origins in this revolutionary period. And when we think about what the founding, I'll put it this way, we hear a lot about what the founding fathers would want. I wanted to go back and actually see, did anybody ask them? Did anybody ask them, hey, do you think this is a nation just for Christians? By and large, they say no. And then is there a test case? The test case is Jews. Do these guys going to have rights? The answer is yes, sure. So what I found is that the early revolutionary days and the Revolutionary War are in many ways a crucible for the Americans, but it's not a case where it's not that what made, sometimes people say, well, all the patriots were Christian. Well, they weren't. Many of them were, but they also understood the value of a society, of a nation that had many different faiths, that we can all work together. We can be citizens. And, when the war ends, the idea of a country where citizenship is not bounded by religious faith is pretty different. And America does take that first big step, and it's a doozy.
Professor, let's talk about another critical term. Again, as I mentioned before we taping the show, that the more I read about this book or the content within this book, particularly that one phrase that stuck with me, again, it's fascinating. Of course, it's very much different from our modern interpretation today, which is called religious pluralism. I mean, again, we've seen the political pluralism and we've seen the economic complication as well. But back in the days, that when we talk about the founding period, we talk about this content within the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the critical founding documents for America. Professor Jortner, how should we define the phrase religious pluralism, that when we look at the Jewish community, or even we'll look at the contribution of the Patriot Jews? So in other words, what is the significance of that? Because again, as I mentioned before, it's not just about what we're talking about, how we are interpreting today. It's actually more than this modern day evangelicalism or even this modern day Christianity. Your thoughts, please.
Sure. I'll say two things. One is what you have in the Patriot ranks as the idea of America as a democracy, as a republic is created, is a variety of different religious opinions, from very passionate, pious Christians to mainline, Presbyterians and Anglicans to Catholics to Jews. There's I can go into greater detail, but I'll stop there. They're all working together towards a common end. And I think that is the nature of the pluralism, that the religious pluralism that the founders are looked to. That's what George Washington, he says, all we require is that each person acquit themselves as a good citizen. It doesn't matter what church you go to, which is to say everybody should get a say, and we're going to work together to figure this out. There are sort of two. I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, not just because the founders did it, but because to think about what are the different ways we can deal with a pluralistic religious society that we live in. Again, we have something like 78% of Americans are some kind of Christian, and there's all sorts of different things there. How do we deal with that? two things that are wrong, I think. One is to say that everybody has to believe that all religions are equal. That's not the case. That's not, when we talk about religious pluralism, we're not saying, hey, you Christians, hey, you Catholics, you have to believe Protestantism is the same. Or, hey, Christians, you have to believe Islam is the same. Or, hey, Muslims, you have to believe Christianity is equal to your religion. That's not what we're talking about. No Christian and no Muslim would accept that. But that's not the standard we have to hit. What the standard we have to hit is, legally and politically, our religion doesn't change our status as citizens. There's not like a citizen plus model for Christians and a citizen minus model for everybody else. That's important to note. And then that gets us to the second thing. A lot of Christians are into this idea in the revolution. They argue that this is good for Christianity. And in fact, some of the most passionate supporters of separating church and state are the Baptists. Because Baptists say, and this is still a tenet of Baptist faith, particularly Southern Baptist Convention today, Baptists say you cannot get any kind of real conversion if you are offering worldly benefits. Which is to say, if I say you can only vote if you're in church X, and in Virginia it was the Anglican church. If I say you can only vote if you're in the Anglican church, then people will join the Anglican church without really believing in it, just because they want to be able to vote or hold office or have whatever kind of special thing they get to have. You cannot compel, Baptists then and now said, you cannot compel belief in Christianity. It must come from the heart. And modern ideas about Christian nationalism, which says that essentially the United States is a Christian nation, it is meant to pursue Christian objectives, however defined, and that Christians are kind of like citizens plus, and everybody else is just there on their say-so. That's a threat to not just, I think, our political order, but to Christians, both conservative, mainline, what have you, because it's saying, hey, if you can show us what a Christian you are, then you'll get all this good extra stuff that these other people won't have. And of course, the revolutionary patriots saw through this. They said, well, that just means people are going to start lying. It's the easiest thing in the world. If you're already a bad person, you would have no compunction about lying to take a test oath to, say, serve in public office. And that is the attitude that ultimately prevails, both in the U.S. Constitution and, I should say, throughout the state legislatures. One of the things that happens almost immediately after the revolution is every state that actually has a synagogue gets rid of its state church. South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, all get rid of their state churches. So anywhere where it would have been an issue, the test oath goes, the fact that only Christians can serve goes away, the state church goes away. And I think that's a clear sign of the kind of democracy, religiously speaking, that the founding fathers were after, which is, in other words, it will be a place where people have to be free to speak their faith, to engage in mission work, and to, do what they believe, but they must comport themselves as good citizens, which is to say, you cannot stop anybody else from having those rights. You certainly don't there's no idea that you have to have this sort of shared idea of we're all the same, which we aren't. But you also are not compelled. You don't have to think everybody's the same. You do have to act as a good citizens. So you do have to, in other words, the state is separate from the church. Your ability to participate in the government is not bound by where or when or how you worship. And those are, and again, that's not just, that's not seculars saying that. That was Christians saying that. They're like, this is great. How do we know we're getting real people to really understand the gospel? Separate church and state.
Professor Jortner, I want to go back to the book. I mean, again, there were so many significant and imperative points that you explained and also you dive into. But let's move on to another topic, religious freedom. I mean, again, this is part of the title of your book as well. But again, I want to read something to you and then let's talk about, or please elaborate a little bit more. And I quote, religious freedom and religious diversity were not the results of later centuries of immigration. They were present at the American founding. Now, I think there are a couple significant points that we can talk about. Number one, how should we define the term of religious freedom? And the second thing is, what is the correlation between the religious freedom and the later centuries of immigration? I mean, again, let's just take a step back. We look at what's happening in the US today. Immigration, it's one of the hot topics. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, it's one of the key or critical aspects that actually will make a political difference. But I believe, going back to your book, we talk about this whole Jewish community. We talk about the presence of the Jews or patriot Jews. And we look at the religious freedom. Putting the three aspects together, what does that mean when we talk about religious freedom? And what does that mean when we talk about the concept of immigration? And plus, you wrote that they were present at the American founding. What are we talking about right here, Professor?
Well, I'll give you two stories to explain that. So the first one I want to talk about, there's a guy named Jonas Phillips, and he's writing to his friend back in Europe about what's happening with the revolution. And he talks about how the American army is full of rukum. And rukum is a Yiddish word meaning tough guys. And there's another letter that another guy in Philadelphia, Jew, writes to somebody. He says, I was going to send you the speech of George III, but it was such narshkeit, I didn't think it was worth it. Narshkeit is Yiddish for nonsense. So there we got these patriots in 1776 using Yiddishisms, that we don't normally associate with the Patriots. And then the Synagogue of Richmond, Virginia, when the war ends, when George Washington becomes the first president, they prepare a special prayer of peace that they read out and that they show to people. And of course, the in Hebrew, the first line of the prayer spells out the Hebrew letters for Washington, because there's no W in Hebrew, so it just says Washington. And this is, again, there's a Hebrew prayer for the country that spells out the word Washington. Now, what do these things tell us about the nature of religious diversity in the United States? It tells us that religious diversity is there at the very beginning. That there are Jewish guys and Jewish men and women doing things that they would do as Jews, acting as Jews, living as Jews, who join the revolution and who become a part of the United States there at the very beginning. And, we Americans, we really like the revolution. We really tend to think that if it happened at the revolution, then it's okay. And there are all kinds of ideas. We need to bring our country back to the 1776 and the way we felt back then. And I sort of, taking those arguments at their word, there is a lot of diversity, religious diversity, in the Patriot ranks. Again, one of the big issue was dealing with Catholics in the army, because the Americans rely heavily on France, which at the time is a Catholic monarchy. And Washington is very cool with having Catholics in the army. Indeed, John Adams, to show how, during one of the various meetings of the Continental Congress, actually leads a bunch of Protestants to a Catholic service just to show them, hey, this is okay. This is not dangerous. We want Catholic patriots to join us. Their religion shouldn't be a barrier to them joining the fight for freedom. There is a mythology, and again, I was sort of surprised to find this myself, that there are these stories of Narishkeit and There's guys who are at Valley Forge who petition Washington. They're starving at Valley Forge. They're freezing. He still asked, "Hey, I can't serve guard duty Friday nights because it is Shabbat. It's the Jewish Sabbath. I don't work." And the army says, "That's fine. You are off. Your night off is Friday nights." We've got the record of that. There's a mythology that different religions or religious diversity shows up later. When we hear language about sort of different people coming to America and sort of changing its character. I mean, that's the threat, right? It is being said now by some people. It was said in the 1920s by people. It was said in the 1820s by people. Oh, look at all these different kinds of people coming in. They're going to change the character of the country. But that kind of diversity, religiously speaking, was already present at the very beginning. It wasn't that one religion fought the revolution and then let everybody else in. A bunch of different religious faiths worked together without sacrificing that faith, without giving that faith up. John Jay, a great American patriot, a very religious guy, wrote some really nasty things about the Jews. He, I'll say it, he was probably anti-Semitic. Was John Jay did he work with Jews anyways? He did. Was John Jay critical in the abolition of slavery in the state of New York? He was. So again, we have to recognize that this is not a search for who said what mean thing, but how did people work together? Again, John Jay, passionate Christian guy, did a lot of good and worked with Jews even though he didn't like Judaism. That's what I'm talking about. I think that the mythology sort of says you have to check in with someone, you have to check what their faith is before you can work with them, before you can work together for a common goal or for the United States. And that is, if people want to say that, they have every right to say it, but it's not true, and it wasn't true in 1776 or 1787.
Well, Professor, I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about another significant person that you wrote in the book. Again, I hope that I'm not butchering the name. It's called Moses Sextus or Sykes. So, Professor, can you help us with a better understanding? Because again, I am not done with the book yet. I mean, again, the more I read about it, the more questions and, of course, the fascination, even the better, I think the better word will be fascination about the historical evidence, about the facts. But you mentioned that about this person, Moses, that it's not just a accident. I mean, we believe that nothing happens by accident. And there has to be, or there had to be, certain reasons, motivations, or even what we say, a divine connection for everything to put together. So, Professor, who was this person? And why was this person so important that as we continue to develop the stories in the book?
I would say, so yeah, these are two of my favorite guys, the Seixas brothers. And your confusion is understandable because their last name is spelled Seixes.
That's right.
And luckily someone wrote a poem about the guys, and they said that's how I learned the word Seixas rhymes with gracious.
Okay.
So thanks for that poem. So the Seixas brothers. And also, by the way, someone once misspelled Gersham's last name as Mr. Sexys, and don't think I didn't put that in the book. But the Seixas brothers, they are sons of an immigrant from Portugal, and they both become sort of big deals. Moses lives in Newport, Rhode Island, where there's a synagogue. Gershom lives in New York, where there's a synagogue. Let me talk about Gershom first. Gershom is a patriot. He's the leader of the synagogue. He's not a rabbi. There are no rabbis in early America. He's what's called a hazan. To be a rabbi, you got to be trained at a yeshiva, and there ain't no yeshivas in the U.S. So he's a hazan. That's his title. He's effectively the clergyman, and he's very pro the revolution. And Congress actually requests that all ministers take a day, call for a day of fasting and prayer. Now, Seixas doesn't have to do that. He's not a minister, but he does it anyway for the synagogue. He calls for a day of fasting and prayer for the Jews. He gives a patriotic sermon. And then when it looks like the British are going to invade and capture New York, he actually leads the patriot Jews of New York out of the city. They bring one of the Torahs with them, and they resettle in Connecticut to live in exile. And this is a big deal because, of course, Judaism, if you're a Methodist or if you're a Pentecostal, you don't need to carry anything with you. There's not a lot of ritual goods you need. But if you're Jewish, you need to have a Torah. You need to have a shofar. You need to have a yod, the pointer, to read the Torah with. So there's some effort involved. You have to, and you need a minyan. You need a group of Jews. They go through the trouble to relocate to Connecticut. Why? That's how they felt about living under British rule. And again, British rule, they didn't know what was going to happen, but they said to themselves, we can't risk it. We're with the Patriots. And they move and they resettle in Connecticut. And then later, they move down to Philadelphia, which is sort of, at that point, is the last town with a synagogue in Patriot hands. And actually, Seixas takes the lead there, and he brings in Jewish men from Georgia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, other places in the New World to found that synagogue. It's a synagogue nationally constructed. It is a synagogue of Jews from all over the country who are patriots, because if you're a patriot Jew and you can afford to flee, you're going to be in Philadelphia. So the Jews kind of get this national synagogue going. Again, again, a symbol of not only how they felt about the revolution, but how at home America felt to them. How, again, one of the first organizations, one of the first religious groups to have a kind of national organization is the Jews. It's not the Baptists and it's not evangelicals it's not the Methodists. We'll put it that way. The Baptists, there are some national Baptist groups. It's the Baptists. I live in Alabama. We love the Baptists. But it's not the Methodists. It's not Presbyterians. It's not evangelicals. It's Jews, which is not to say, ooh, they were first. It is to say, look how comfortable they were at the moment of the founding. And look how comfortable the country was with them, generally speaking. Of course, they get nasty letters. Of course, they run into legal problems and they have to deal with, it's not a utopia. But the fact is, they didn't get shut down. They didn't get kicked out. They were accepted. And then when the Constitution passes in Philadelphia, they have this huge parade to celebrate the passage of the Constitution. They have a march. All of the clergy of the city are marching in the parade. And when the parade ends, there's a kosher table set aside for the Jews and the Hazan, which is to say, the Patriots, broadly speaking, were so comfortable with Judaism that they were like, we can set up a separate table for the Jews so you guys can join us. That's easy. They did it. And then his brother Moses in Rhode Island is the guy who comes to George Washington with his letter, the famous letter that the Newport Synagogue writes to Washington, and Washington writes back, essentially asking, hey, Mr. President, are we going to have full rights? Given how much we've sacrificed, given that our community gave as much as anybody else did, and that's true, Jews serve in the army in proportion to their numbers in the general population. Which is remarkable given that no Jews in Europe really had a military tradition in any family. There's no Jewish family of Europe that has a military tradition. That starts in the revolution. So Moses says, given that we've done all these things, are we going to have full citizenship? And Washington writes back, this is a country that gives to bigotry no sanction, but only requires that you comport yourself as a good citizen, and all may rest under their vine and fig tree. Now, of course, we know that America doesn't get full freedom for everybody right after the revolution. But I do think it's worth pausing and thinking about the way in which here is a group of Americans who didn't have citizenship, who didn't have full freedom. There's various laws controlling the Jews under the colonial regime. And through the process of revolution, their freedom actually expands, which is to say the revolution does increase. There are ways in which freedom is bigger after the revolution than before the revolution. So the revolution is not just fought to preserve some kind of Christian order or Christian freedom. It's done by a bunch of different people who then, when they are done with the fighting, have this idea of maybe this can be a pluralistic society. And I absolutely grant you, the talking about rights, full rights, civil rights for Baptists and Jews and Catholics. It's a small piece of a really big puzzle. But I do think it's significant that there is that movement, that there is a way in which the revolution creates freedom and builds a world where citizens don't have to confess faith before they take their citizenship duties, which means, again, and I have a very Baptist position on this, which is, again, you give to the state what you can give to the state, and you give to God what is God's, which is to say your decisions about how to worship God, what you believe about God, come from your heart and your mind and your spirit, and they're not affected by the government you live under.
Well, Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called A Promised Land: Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. Well, let's just say, Professor, anyone who's not familiar with the Jewish Patriots, again, it's not familiar or perhaps still in the process of learning about the Jews that contributed to the American Revolution, what would you expect the readers to understand and appreciate when we finish reading the last chapter of this book? I mean, again, when we talk about American Revolution, it's not a conversation that can be concluded within an hour. Or, I mean, it's a journey, it's an exploration. I mean, it's a lifelong learning about what this country has gone through in the past more than 200 years. So going back to the question, your final thoughts, what would you expect the readers to appreciate when we finish reading the last chapter or even the last page of this book?
I've been very blessed in my life to be a member of two different communities, the Jewish community and the evangelical Christian community. And as I've talked about the book to both audiences, they've both been really excited about it. So I think anybody can read this book. I will say, I think for Jewish readers, it will be eye-opening about how far back Judaism goes. It is, I found it to be a real breath of fresh air, which is to say, no, Judaism doesn't arrive for the first time in this country after a bunch of stuff happens. It's there right in 1776. And I think that's important for how we think of what it means to be an American Jew. And I think for evangelicals, I think they're very interested in this because here are some historical facts about what people were really like at the beginning of the United States of America. And a book that talks about the religion of the time in what I hope is an honest way, not to say everybody's this way, everybody's this way, everybody's that way, and not in a way that says it's the Christians versus the secularists. That's not how it works out. There are passionate Christian Protestants, there are passionate Catholics, there are, middle of the road Christians, there are guys who go to church but definitely don't really mean it. I'm looking at you, Alexander Hamilton, and there are Jews, and there's this great diversity there. There's even in India, of course, the American Revolution expands and British fight French and South Asian forces. The guy who's there's a commander there called Hyder Ali, who's a Muslim sultan. He's fighting the British, and the Americans talk about him. Founding fathers write letters about this Muslim guy who's their ally in India, being like, how's he doing? Have you heard this? I think that Britain's going to collapse in India. It's going to be great. So big diversity there. And I think seeing that can help give us a sense of how the revolution worked, and that can help us see them as human beings and not as just examples. One thing, the hard thing about talking about the revolution in 2024, part of it is that everyone, we tend to talk in sound bites or social media clips, and it's easy. A lot of times people say the founding fathers wanted, and then they kind of say whatever that they want.
Right.
This is a case of, let's look at some of the founding fathers. Let's look at the founding generation. So not just Washington Jefferson, but guys like Jonas Phillips and Gershom Satius. And what are they doing? How do they live it out? How is freedom real for them? And that can, I hope that will help us change the tenor of our conversation, not just for election season, but sort of ongoing. I don't think the revolution should be, I don't think the revolution is, and it shouldn't be, a place where we fight with each other. I think it's very serious. We're going to have disagreements about it, but I hope when they finish the last page, they can look back at some of the details of the revolution and think about what can be used here. What's the example here that we want to follow? What is that there is a positive legacy in the revolution. We don't have to accept everything the revolution did, because there's some not great stuff in there.
Right.
But it doesn't have to. This moment shouldn't be a divider for us. This is a case where real freedoms were achieved, real victories were achieved. How did that work? And then take another look and say, okay, how did the things that didn't happen not happen? And how can we change that? To sort of think about, there is a sense, I think there is a commonality here for many Americans to glob onto. And in that sense, I think the revolution could be a unifying force in American life and American politics. And that is, that's the strange fate of the Jewish patriots, that I think they're a small group, but I'm hopeful that they will bring us together and get us really talking about what really happened in the revolution, and not just shouting sound bites.
Well, of course, Professor, with that said, I agree with you 100%. I mean, again, politics is complicated. Yeah. But I always say, when we look at what's happening today, let's not only have this expectancy about the future, but also we need to understand, again, what the nation has gone through. And also the people, and also, again, this diversity that actually put the efforts together, have this unification and seeing the bigger picture and appreciate the successes and also the effort that we all collectively contributed. Well, ladies and gentlemen,
and if I can just jump in, Will, I want to just say I agree, and I just want to remind listeners too that I don't think the important thing about if you get this book or you just hear this podcast, the important thing isn't to go on social media and talk about it to the world. Although certainly if you wanted to promote my book, I won't argue. But to also think about this is not just going to be done through the news. This has to be done in our communities.
That's right.
And I really hope that, because this is where, in my experience, the rubber really hits the road. When we confront religious discrimination, when we have conflicts over prayer in school, even in our own communities, this is where that work has to take place. So I hope it will not only encourage people to sort of build bridges nationally, but also in your own communities to sort of reach out and think about the ways in which this revolution can bring us together, not as an abstract nation, but just in your own hometown.
That's right. And also keep on praying for this country as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Adam Jortner. Again, Dr. Adam Jortner is a specialist in the American history of religion and the American Revolution, and also the early nation, with particular emphasis on religious liberty, patriotism, theology, and new religious tradition. I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing book, again, which is called A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. And meanwhile, we're very excited about our next conversation regarding American Revolution. So thank you so much for doing this.